Welcome to another episode of Parallax, and good morning and welcome to Ambassador Neelam Deo. Thank you for being with us today. The ambassador has had over 33 years of experience as the ambassador to Denmark, former ambassador to Denmark, Ivory Coast, Guinea, Niger, the list goes on. More importantly, and of concern to our discussion today, is your experience in the US as a liaison to the US Congress for Strategic Affairs. As you know, the IPCS is organizing a series of videos on the 2020 US presidential elections. And this is the fourth and final installment of the series. And our focus today, of course, is going to be the future of India-US relations. And as the legal process of, the administration change now is finally underway, it gives us a good time to assess the last 4 years and examine the possibilities of the next 4 years. And so, Madam Ambassador, what I'd like to begin with is an assessment of the Trump administration's impact on the US-India strategic partnership. What, in your view, has been the hits and misses of the last 4 years?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me on to this. Before I answer your specific question relating to Indo-US, I have a couple of things I want to say. One is that, however graceless President Trump may have been in the transition process, it is well to remember that he's not unique. When he got elected, and in fact, all throughout the 4 years that he was president, the Democrats kept hammering home, or at least claiming that that Hillary Clinton had lost the election only because of Russian interference. So I just wanted understood that Trump is what we call a dramebaz, but that doesn't mean that there is anything unique about this. In fact, the Democrats went so far as to impeach President Trump. They weren't able to pull together enough on the Russia angle, which they really believe. And so it was about Ukraine and a telephone call with the Ukrainian president. But this is very important to remember, because grudges are not forgotten in the American system, and they are not forgotten in our system or any other. So yes, there will be a big effort by this administration to overturn all the things that Trump did, just as Trump made a full effort to overturn everything that the Obama-Biden administration had achieved, but with particular focus on a domestic issue, on the issue of healthcare. So let us not assume that some great aberration has happened in American in the history of American democracy, and actually things will proceed as they used to proceed every time there was a change of administration, except for one interesting fact, that Trump is one of the very few, only the third in the last 100 years, of incumbent presidents who lost a second term, who did not win a second term. So that's one. The other thing I think that everyone should pay attention to is the 4 priorities that Biden administration has set for itself. And of course, they concern domestic issues, because the social structure, society in the United States is deeply polarized. Again, as it is everywhere else. We know that our own society is polarized, but this is again not a unique feature. So not such a big transformation of the American situation. So Biden has put forth 4 priorities. One is, of course, the pandemic. And this is very important because he campaigned on the pandemic, and the Trump administration stands indicted on its careless, indifferent attitude towards dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, except to use it as an attack on China. Right. The second priority is economy, and that is obviously the priority of everyone in the world, to reset their economies, but it means specifically 2 things. again, in America, as in India, as everywhere else. One is to generate employment because the rate of unemployment has risen. And the other is to try and address inequality of incomes, because that is a big part of the social divide in the United States and in many ways in other countries as well. The third that they have set out is climate change. And climate change, again, incorporates one very essential item, which is important also for foreign policy, and that is green technology, innovation. I mean, they are very concerned that China is racing ahead, both on bringing down its carbon emissions, on racing ahead on EVs, on electrical vehicles, and is actually the leader in storage batteries at the moment. So they're very keen to somehow try and promote innovation in all the climate change technologies so that America can get ahead or stay ahead. That, of course, is a different matter. And the fourth issue that they have mentioned is the racism and social justice. This was also a big element in the election campaign of both parties, with President Trump issuing many dog whistles to his base, which consisted largely of non-graduate white workers, many of whom had lost their jobs, but many of whom were still doing quite well, but very concerned that they were losing status to minorities, Black and brown. So it should interest Indians as well, who should not be seeing this as a Black versus white issue, as well as social justice, again, which is income inequality. Now, having put those four, what I'm trying to suggest when people are trying to understand where the opportunities and issues for India-US relations lie is in trying to find an opportunity in American priorities. Because America remains the largest, most important country in the world. It is still way ahead of China in all the indices of power, whether it is the GDP, whether it is military spending, whether it is a technologically advanced and innovative economy, whether it is the best educational institutions. Therefore, we have to find opportunities. We should not sit and wait thinking we are so important that the Americans will come running and find opportunities. And I want to stress this, because sometimes there is an attitude in India where, we expect the other party, whether it is America or Germany or anyone else, to come looking for opportunities to engage with us. We need to be proactive. We are still not such a big economy or a major military power as to expect others to look up to us. So now, to answer the questions that you have sent me, Siddharth, one is, how have the 4 years of Trump affected India-US strategic partnership? So I would say that under Trump, the strategic partnership has become strong and it has become deep. But alongside, we need to remember that on trade and economic issues, we have had a lot of differences and a lot of grief from the Trump administration. So what are the specifics of the strategic relationship? One is that the Pacific Command has been renamed the IndoPacific Command. And this is very important because the concept of Indo-Pacific has not just been accepted as an academic concept. It is being built into their systems and institutions. And that is important because then it becomes something that is implemented, something that is in place for the long run. The second very important thing that has happened is that we have completed signing of the 4 fundamental agreements with the United States, which have two major implications, or maybe three. One is, of course, that you now have access to defense high technology as well as defense high-tech systems,
Yes.
which earlier used to be denied to India, which then slowly began to be approved on a case-by-case basis, but now the approvals will be becoming automatic. The other is that it enables uh, intelligence sharing. And intelligence sharing has to be understood as intelligence sharing in tech terms, in cyber terms, so that the technology for enabling our missiles, which may be pointed north or east, to be targeted more specifically, depending on where the targets there are. So this is a very important feature which tends to get overlooked. And the third thing is, of course, the access to using each other's military facilities for refueling, for mid-air refueling, being able to use American bases, just as Americans warships, etc., can come to India. This all contributes and enables the interoperability that is so important in the Quad, which we have been talking about. That is the next.
If I could, madam,
Please.
I think it's quite interesting that you say it has not only, I think, to most outsiders, we do see it as, becoming deeper and a lot more cemented, if you will, permanent. But I would also like to ask you then, how would you view what has been termed as President Trump's sort of transactional foreign policy, how that has impacted India, and then how President-elect Biden is now promising strategic stability. So these two terms, right, transactional and strategic stability, how would you then see the Indian-US partnership or relationship moving forward?
Transactional is a very, let me say, it's a shallow term and it's used lazily. So everyone is transactional, frankly speaking. When we say, Indira Gandhi once said that India is neither east nor west, it is for India only. Well, in that sense, Trump made it vulgar by talking about America first and all that. But foreign policy, as all relationships, are transactional. Why will Germany do something for us unless it has some value for Germany? So I don't think one should get into these kind of semantics. But strategic stability is important. Because what happened in the Trump administration is that by constantly bad-mouthing NATO, the Europeans got very worried about American commitment to NATO. And he actually said that, do you really think that if something happens to Latvia or Estonia, that we all have to go and fight for it? And now Latvia and Estonia may be only, 1 million, 3 million people. But if they are members of NATO, then they have to be treated equally as you would act if it were Germany or the UK. So to Europeans, it's very important, this aspect of whether, and this has to do with the divide in American society, where although Trump was defeated, he won 71 million votes. That's almost 50% of the voting public. So what they're saying is, can we now trust any American administration? Because Trump is talking about fighting the election again in 24, but whether he does or not, it doesn't matter. Can another Trump-like figure come in and again overturn all the old arrangements, the old international order? So their stability actually does become very important. But I should say that no matter what Biden does, the Europeans have moved ahead on trying to build up their own security policies, and there is renewed emphasis on an EU foreign policy and an EU defense strategy. And that is a recognition of the fact that American power has waned. It has become less than it used to be. America can no longer tell everybody what they can do or what they should do or shouldn't do, etc. Whereas China's power has increased tremendously, and it is a peer competitor of the United States today, even more important in some ways than the Soviet Union was during the Cold War, and we can come to that later.
In that case, in that case, madam,
yes.
maybe if we are now seeing this sort of shift, not only in relationships between America and its traditional allies, also deepening of relationship or ties between America and its partners such as India during this sort of strategic competition with China, then in that case, I'd like to take it a little more specific to South Asia to see how the Biden administration will now approach South Asia, not only with this baggage of, waning American soft power, differences in priorities and interests, but also now that India has a growing role in the strategic competition against China in the Indo-Pacific, so on and so forth. How will the Biden administration sort of iron out the differences that we have in West Asia vis-a-vis India? And then, of course, we'll have to move it to the other side to look at, our neighbor in the north, which is China. So maybe you could give us an assessment of, what the Afghanistan plan will be, how that will affect India, Pakistan plan will be affect India, and then China, and then India.
So I would say that take Afghanistan, India is not a player. It has not been a player even during the Trump administration when a lot of other trilateral forums were set up. India does have one big asset, and that is soft power with the Afghan population, and maybe to some extent with the Ghani government, though the Ghani government itself is being sidelined by the agreement between the United States and the Taliban. I don't think anybody else is going to be trying to protect Indian interests in Afghanistan. And of course, because they're trying to arrive at a deal, Pakistan has got a renewed role in the whole thing, although it had been really stigmatized by Trump because of its terrorist activities. So I think Afghanistan has given a new role to Pakistan, but simultaneously to our west, what has happened is the changed West Asia landscape. Our external affairs minister is there today, cementing relationships, taking them even further with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, all the West Asian, Bahrain. And simultaneously, you will have noted that UAE has issued a circular refusing visas to a number of Islamic countries, including Pakistan. So I think we should not look at Afghanistan in isolation, because to our west is also West Asia. 3 countries have already normalized relationship with Israel. Saudi Arabia was, and maybe still is, under intense pressure from the Americans to do so. Now, the Biden administration not going to go back on what Trump and co have changed in West Asia. They will not move the embassy out of Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. They will not try and, they won't exert the same level of pressure on countries to normalize with Israel, but they will not tell UAE not to go ahead with the normalization. So those changes won't take place. But one very important possibility only, you must remember, is Iran, is with Iran. Because it was the Obama-Biden administration which had negotiated the JCPOA, particularly John Kerry. Now, John Kerry is back in the administration as an envoy on climate change, but he will have a lot to say on Iran, even if it is privately said. Most of the sanctions on Iran have been enacted by the US Congress. And as yet, we don't know whether the Democrats will control the Senate or not. They have control of the House, but it's a reduced control. And you can only use your capital in the Congress for so many things. So whether Biden will actually spend political capital on Iran or not, all of this remains uncertain. But I think what we won't see is continued abuse of Iran, more sanctions, and there will be efforts to interpret the sanctions in ways that enable Iran to have some breathing space. For example, by giving presidential waivers,
Right.
as was given to us even by the Trump administration on the Chabahar port. So we can expect that on the West, there will be some easing, but not on Afghanistan, because keeping American troops outside has become so unpopular that I think unless the Biden administration is able to replace them with special forces, it will not be possible to keep regular troops in Afghanistan for a very long period of time.
I'd like
On
to
the,
imagine now if we could just
please,
move to Pakistan possibly. And I mentioned these three countries in order because of, you know, the statements made by President-elect Biden during his campaign. One of the promises, and obviously, is the standing with India against all forms of aggression and terrorism, so on and so forth. And obviously, in any sort of discussion about terrorism, aggression vis-a-vis India, Pakistan always rears its head. And I was wondering, maybe you could just give an assessment of maybe your insights on what do you think President-elect Biden, how will he approach not only Pakistan regarding US-Pakistan relations, US-Pakistan relations, but also, you know, the India-Pakistan-US sort of dynamic that has unraveled itself over the last couple of years. There's been an attempt to rehyphenate, dehyphenate, so on and so forth. What will happen during a Biden administration?
so if you are in a roundabout way asking me about Kashmir and Article 370, we can come to that directly.
Okay.
I think there will be some pressure on India because there is a shallow understanding of the issues in America. Only a few members of the House, Premila Jayapal most prominently, has been raising this issue, and she received support on that from the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. But the support had more to do with the fact that our External Affairs Minister cancelled a meeting with the House Foreign Relations Committee because Premila Jayapal, who is not a member of that committee, had decided to attend that meeting.
Okay.
So I think we have to know that India has always had Americans telling us or trying to put pressure on us on human rights issues. When I was in Washington and dealing with the Congress, the issue was Punjab and Khalistan and all of that. So, but India is a big country. It's a democracy. It is mature enough, I think, to be able to absorb some criticism, open and private. I think under Biden, the criticism will be more private on human rights issues. And on human rights issues, there is some criticism that we deserve. I mean, after all, these former political leaders were kept under house arrest or whatever it was for over a year. You know, internet access was reduced. All of these are now treated as human rights issues. So there will be some criticism. But I think we will be able to absorb that because India's importance in dealing with our neighbor to the north has become so much more critical, and because China has become a peer competitor of the United States. So that is why in the last days of the Trump administration, there were these two high-profile events relating to India and the Quad. One was the meeting of the Quad foreign ministers in person during the pandemic in Japan. And the other was the 2+2 meeting in India, where the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense came to India and had a meeting with their Indian counterparts. Now, obviously, what is said to the public after the meetings is fairly anodyne. But the importance of these two meetings should not be underestimated. Now, it's also a fact that as soon as they went back, Trump sacked his defense secretary. Esper was removed by tweet. But the fact is the meeting took place, understandings were arrived at, some decisions were taken. Now, I do not expect at all that the Biden administration will try and reverse any of those. because not only has Biden said that they would, his team has said that they think that Trump had got China right. They've acknowledged that.
Yes.
And Trump and Biden himself called the Chinese president a thug. Now,
Yes.
that is equating him with Putin. And the bad feelings towards Russia and Putin that Biden and his administration have are really extreme. So I think that, again, as in many other things, the tone in relationship with China will change, but not the substance. None of the measures taken by the Trump administration will be reversed there. And all of that, that is why, even though there are differences with India, but there are always differences with democracies. When you look at the differences that these fellows had with China, with Canada, I mean, to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum for national security interests, the Europeans, the Canadians were up in arms. They also affected us, but when you see that they don't care about, Germany or Canada, then we know that we have to absorb it.
Correct.
So the same thing will happen.
So
in that sense, there will be differences, including on trade issues, but those differences will not supersede the strategic convergence.
I think, we've nicely sort of segued into what I think would be, the three big issues in my mind. And like, as you're saying, there won't be sort of reversals of Trump administration policies vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific, which is why, as you can see, I've also asked, what will be the approach to the Asia reassurance and Indo-Pacific deterrence initiatives? Will they be expanded? What will the changes be? What will the thrust be? And more importantly, I think out of all of these, usually what happens is, and I think in the last year, the view of India-US relations has been particularly securitized, and we don't look at the economics of it, right? And how are we going to further integrate our economies, increase in equitable exchange, so on and so forth. Now with the RCEP also finally being signed, I think there's going to be an intense pressure on the US and its allies and partners in the region to actually develop something that is either a TPP 2.0 or something to that format. I was wondering what you think the changes will be when it comes to these three issues: the Asia reassurance, Indo-Pacific, and then economic pacts and trade and so on.
Yes, so those two, the Asia reassurance initiative and the Indo-Pacific, those two acts, they are like our legislation in Parliament. They are enabling. You can do things because that act has been passed, and you can also prevent some things because of an act gets passed. These were passed with quite a lot of support in the Congress, including from members of the Democratic Party. So they will not be reversed. How much importance is given to them will vary depending on what will be the outcome of talks with the Chinese. Because the American administration, every administration, will continue to have talks with the Chinese. It depends on the level. It depends what are the items in those discussions. It depends on whether the Chinese feel any pressure to make any change or not. So those acts will remain there. They can be used. And where money has been set aside in two cases, that money will flow for those purposes. So, but they will not be determining almost anything. What will happen, I think, is if in the talks that are held and in the interactions with the Chinese, I think China looks like it's in no mood to make any compromises with anybody. And if you just look at the way it behaves, either with, say, Australia, which had upped its partnership of the Quad, but also asked that there be a proper investigation of the origin of the COVID-19 virus. I mean, they issued them a 14-point charter, basically telling them what they can do in their own country. And, something that is just as ridiculous, if not more ridiculous, than what Saudi Arabia gave to Qatar. Close Al Jazeera, don't talk to so-and-so, don't import from so-and-so. I mean, telling the Australians that how they should not object to China's treatment of Chinese origin Australians in Australia. I mean, this kind of rubbish. Do you know the Chinese ambassador in Sweden said over some criticism that Sweden made of the Uyghur issue or something. He said, well, for our friends, we have gifts, we have presents,
Right.
and for our enemies, we have shotguns. I mean, this is the way ambassadors are talking.
Yeah.
And this is not freelancing. I mean, the Australian ambassador, Chinese ambassador in Australia said that Australia was like a piece of chewing gum under the boot of the Chinese. So, but this was not, absolutely not freelancing.
Mhm.
This wolf warrior business was signaling to the whole world that China will not only not put up with any criticism, just criticism, it will also have consequences. In the case of Australia, you know that they have stopped importing certain goods, pretending it has to do with quality and standards. With Norway, from 2012, when Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Prize, they stopped importing Norwegian salmon.
Salmon, yes.
Now, Norwegian salmon had 70% market share in China, and the Norwegians tried to hold out. But then they went on their knees and they signed a joint statement saying that they would not offend Chinese core interests. Things like that. You have to understand how much pressure China exerts, and unfortunately, how easily even rich, developed Western governments give in for corporate interests, for profit. Right, for years, Angela Merkel had made the relationship with China the centerpiece of her foreign policy. She visited China 12 times or 13 times. And why? Because it is the biggest market for German cars and, the French. So much praise of the Chinese system because they're trying to sell wine and French perfume and, luxury goods and things. So now, I'm not saying that governments should go against their corporate interests, but I'm saying governments find now that given what Chinese attitude has been, that more and more they have to make a choice. You can either sell your cars there or have American security blanket as you have enjoyed for 70 years.
I think maybe you could possibly, can one make the assessment now that the era of hedging is done, now it's time to make a choice in the Indo-Pacific? Can that be said?
No, I think you can't. And the reason for that is precisely the strategic stability discussion we already had. Because no one is sure whether America will, under Trump, every day there was concern that America will make a deal with China. And he tried. If China purchases so much agricultural commodities, worth 240 billion or some such thing, he was willing to lift the bans on Chinese technology, etc. So hedging is not over at all. All the hedging that Europeans and everyone else did will continue and will remain in place. Also because every economy is so interlinked with Chinese economy. It is the global supply chains. Now, Trump and co had brought in initiatives like secure supply chains rather than the least cost supply chains. They and the Japanese had put money, I think $2.5 billion from Japan to encourage their companies to relocalize either to Japan or into ASEAN countries. And only recently has Japan included India within the use of that money. So yes, the deglobalization out of China has begun. It's very small at the moment. It still remains a China plus policy where corporations are also setting up manufacturing units elsewhere, whether it is going back to America or in Thailand or in Bangladesh or wherever. But it has to pick up momentum. Once it picks up a little more momentum, then we'll see. And some of this will depend on how Chinese continue to act. If they continue to threaten Taiwan, then Foxconn is already building a facility near Chennai.
Yes.
Then it will build even more and bigger, because India is a big market. The same will apply to, iPhones, or to, automobile sector, or to the battery sector, because these are all now known technologies. So but that momentum may take some years before it can have a perceptible impact. Meanwhile, China has not been sitting on its hands. It has increased the percentage of domestic consumption in its GDP so that the economy is stable. It has also moved up the value chain. It is ahead of everyone else in artificial intelligence, for instance. So all of this is the creating an ecosystem for innovation and high technology. It is still very discontinuous. It is still very dependent on imports from American multinationals. And that is why you saw what happened with Huawei and with ByteDance now on the TikTok issue. But that does not mean that the Chinese economy will crash just because a few multinationals relocate out of China. So I think hedging will definitely continue, again, for the same reason that, nationalism may return in an even more virulent form in America, and you may, as they say, Trumpism will survive Trump.
Yes. I think what before we close, Ambassador, I'd like to return to what you had said in the beginning of our conversation, which is that India cannot be, waiting for our partners to come and show us the way to our opportunities. We need to be able to leverage these opportunities as and when we see them. And I would like to ask you what you think would be possibly the top 3 priorities or 3 interests or 3 opportunities that India can now leverage in this Biden administration for the next 4 years.
So I'll say 1 or 2 things. I think we have to recognize that, yes, we didn't sign RCEP because of the considerations of the government. But simultaneously, if we keep raising import duties and we do not have consistent legal practices, Vodafone has won its case for the 3rd or 4th time, but we have decided to go in appeal. You cannot do that. You cannot change your laws retroactively and expect anyone to come in and invest. That is why you have lots of money flowing into the stock exchange, but no FDI coming into India. So I think we have to understand, we have to remember what used to be our strengths. The legal system, consistency under law, these are extremely important. The government has taken some measures, some kind of reform on land acquisition, on labor laws, all of those issues. In the agriculture sector, now this could be a big change, but we have dealt with our opposition in India in not very productive ways.
Yes.
Opposition is not strong enough to overturn the government. So in that sense, there is stability, but it does not accept anything that the government does, and that because the relationship is so bad. So that's one thing. Everything we want from the Biden administration or any other country in the world, we really need domestic stability. We need our economic framework to be consistent. People should know what your laws are going to be for the next at least 5 years. You cannot change ad hoc every budget. That's why budget is a bad exercise. Actually, most countries don't have an annual budget because that gives us, and there's the temptation always to make some changes. We should not be making changes like that all the time. And the other thing, of course, is to fulfill the commitments that we undertake. Now, we have undertaken commitments in the Quad, in the bilateral relationship with the United States. We must fulfill those. We must be proactive, not just in going and making visits and trying to build a relationship. But I want to say one last thing before I close, and that is that, fortunately, I mean, this is by chance. The External Affairs Minister of India at this moment was our ambassador in Washington during the Obama-Biden second administration. So he knows some of these people personally, and then followed up as foreign secretary. So he has had engagement with those figures in the Biden administration who have been announced already. That is always a useful thing. We also have in Washington at the moment a very good ambassador who has experience in the Congress, and he has handled interaction with the US Congress quite brilliantly before. So I think we are well placed with the incoming administration.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. It's a privilege to have you on and actually get to talk to you. I think we've covered most, if not all, of our topics for this discussion. While I would have liked to spend a little more time on diaspora, unfortunately, time constraints are always there. Again, thank you so much for coming and taking part in this Parallax.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.